I'm not sure if there's a correlation between the Nuclear-Free Berkeley Act and why the first two rows are activated here. That's unusual. Yeah.
I'm here. Watch out.
We have two speakers today. Gordon Wozniak, I've been very privileged to know since I first came to as a postdoc in 1977 to Berkeley Lab, and you were a postdoc at the same time?
I don't remember.
All right.
It was a long time.
You were a student of
Probably, yeah.
Barto?
No, Joseph.
Joe Sturdy. And he had a long and distinguished career here at the lab, and then went into public service. He was a member of the Berkeley City Council, and was a voice of reason for 13 years, and still continues to do good things on our behalf. Andrew here is one of our own graduate students. He is in the thermal hydraulics group and has been very active in the outreach group. And today, Gordon and Andrew are going to talk to us about the Berkeley Nuclear-Free Act, Past and Future. I'll read the very short abstract. The Berkeley Nuclear-Free Act was passed as a voter initiative in 1986 and established the city of Berkeley as a nuclear-free zone. This had ramifications on the city of Berkeley's relationship with the University of California and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, as well as the city's investments in business contracts. As global politics and the number of nuclear weapon states have changed since the original law passed, this law should be updated for the current global political crisis. Climate, sorry. Everything is a crisis. Therefore, we are planning on putting a voter initiative on 2018's ballot for the city of Berkeley that updates the law and shifts its focus to the existential threat of nuclear weapons and to promoting non-proliferation. So, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Gordon and to Andrew.
Okay, thank you for coming. As Carl said, I was a nuclear scientist for about 30 years and been on the city council for 12 years, and one of the things we had to grapple with was this Nuclear-Free Act and to try to make sense out of various aspects of it. So I'm going to give the first part of the talk. Andrew will talk about more what we plan to do in the future, and I'm going to try to give you, some of my reaction and attempts to understand how this act came about and some of the crazy things that it did. So the first is there was also another nuclear engineering student, Teresa Kelsey Green, who started work on this project. And as I say, in the beginning, about a year ago, Andrew and Kelsey sent me an email saying that they were interested in they said, I think, repealing the Nuclear-Free Act, and they said that they were interested in trying, nuclear energy and get it into the debate with climate change and stop the association with nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, which is one of the things that the Nuclear-Free Act ties together. And they asked if I would, give them some advice. And so I agreed to meet with them and consult. But I want to say that essentially all the work on the ordinance has been done mostly by Andrew and initially with help from Kelsey. So let's go back, particularly for millennials, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the atomic age and the vision that came out of that and how we got to eventually this Nuclear-Free Act in 1986 and what we think would be more appropriate in 2017 and 2018. So the first thing I want to remind you of is there's a very strong dualism in humanity. I mean, you see this in religion, you see it in myths, we even see it in modern things like Star Wars. There's the Force and has a good side and a dark side. Well, much of humanity and Christianity, even there's sin and there's goodness, and they weigh the soul in the end. If it's more lightness and dark, then it floats, and if it doesn't, it sinks down to hell. Okay, so dualism is a very strong. And when nuclear radioactivity was discovered, Frederick Soddy was very important in saying that it was the transmutation of elements that actually produced this radiation. And one of the things that came out of this was that there was a tremendous amount of power released. They calculated how much power there was released by a gram of radium. And he wrote a very a book that had a lot of influence. It was called The Interpretation of Radium, where he basically said there was such power here that we could recreate the Garden of Eden. We could make the poles, warm and water the deserts, and it was this very optimistic vision. Now, there was another physicist who calculated that you could actually raise the entire British fleet 3,000 feet. Okay, and that gave a little bit of a scarier scenario. And it's interesting, H.G. Wells in 1913, this is a year before the First World War, wrote this book called The World Set Free. And in it, he postulates a war in the 1950s where some sorts of atomic bombs are dropped from airplanes, destroying most of the major cities in the world. And then the survivors come to their senses and elect a world government, and then they use nuclear power to basically create a Garden of Eden, to water the deserts and make atom-powered cars. And Wells basically took both aspects of this duality, destruction and rebirth, and using the power for good things to show this vision. Okay, and so that's something that's been with nuclear energy since almost the beginning. This book was written in 1913.
That could not have been his sketch. It was a terribly
No.
realistic mushroom cloud.
Yeah.
He would have
Well,
done a little bit more.
Well, then he actually called it an atomic bomb.
Wow.
But it was based on radioactivity rather than fission. He didn't know about fission. So there is this duality in the way nuclear power is looked at, and is going to cause Armageddon because humans have godlike powers. Are we going to create this shining city? And then when they discovered fission and we dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima, there were a lot of people who started worrying about the devastation, even though one was able to actually, though there was much devastation from the bomb, they were actually able to, make it, turn that area into a little city afterwards. So a couple more points is that one of the things that sort of increased the vision that the dark side was winning was that the military and the politicians sort of said, well, nuclear bombs are just another tool in the military toolbox, okay? And they had people standing out here watching it in the Nevada test site, atmospheric tests. And in fact, in one of the ones in the Pacific, they had VIPs sitting in lawn chairs, like they were at the beach, wearing dark glasses. And there was an attempt to say that this was something that would be very useful in many, many different military situations. Another driver for sort of making people worry that whether is this really sort of this forbidden knowledge was this bigger or better era where we went to the H-bomb and then they decided to see how big an H-bomb, and the Russians finally exploded a bomb. It was called Tsar Bomba. That was a 50 megaton bomb. So that caused people to think, do you really need such big bombs? Fortunately, I think there was a physicist bomb designer who said, gee, the destructive power goes as the cube root of the power of the bomb. So making it bigger is not a very efficient way. It's better to spread it out like the MERS, a larger number of smaller bombs, and you get equivalent destructive power. But this increasing amount of destructive power, scared a lot of power, or at least got people to start to think, is this under control and what can we do? And then there were lots and lots of nuclear tests. There were over like 2,000 over a half a century. And what's interesting is some countries like China and the United Kingdom only did about 45, where the Soviet United States did on the order of 1,000 to develop a rather limited set of deterrents with limited capability, not universal capability. So where were we in 1986 when this ordinance came about, the nuclear free ordinance? Well, this is a plot from the Bullet Atomic Sciences of the number of warheads. And 1986, we were at a high point. There were over 60,000 warheads in the stockpile at that point. Okay, they were testing still. The comprehensive test ban treaty wasn't until 1996. They were testing on the order of like 40 a year, so it was several a month. And so there was a lot of concern that the dark side was winning and there needed some sort of pushback and it was not done by necessarily people who knew a lot about nuclear weapons or how they're produced in the nuclear fuel cycle. It was people who were lots of times the humanities were just concerned, okay? And they said, there's too many, they're too big, and we have to do something. And so I think what I remember, and Bob Budge's may have a slightly different, I think the first nuclear free ordinance actually came from Missouri, Columbus, Missouri, where there was a reactor. And so it was also tied with reactors, okay? So let's look at what does the Nuclear Berkeley Free Act do as it was passed, and its purpose was to make Berkeley nuclear free. It was sort of like a ritual purification, saying we can't get the United States government to get rid of these nuclear weapons. Maybe we can purify Berkeley and get rid of them all in Berkeley. So they said we don't want to do any nuclear weapons work in Berkeley. That's how we're going to oppose the arms race. We want to have a peace conversion plan, which never got drafted, fell by the wayside, which would seem would be important. They were interested in citizens' right to know, and the other thing that they were going to limit nuclear weapons work by minimizing the city contracts with and investments in the nuclear weapons industry, which included both the federal government, the University of California, and corporations. They prohibited nuclear reactors because reactors were seen as part of the nuclear weapons problem, even though the first bomb, Hiroshima, was actually done with accelerated technology, Caltrons. It was a 235 bomb. That somehow accelerators were actually specifically exempted, along with medical use of radiation in the ordinance. They also prohibited food radiation plant. It's not quite clear, other than like radiation. And then where reactors also fell into, they opposed the nuclear fuel cycle as a whole. So a lot of this was because of proximity, actually, I think, aimed at the University of California as a whole, okay? And they didn't make a distinction between the campuses that didn't do classified research and the weapons labs, also in Livermore or Berkeley, which doesn't do classified research. And which is interesting, because for the federal government, they made the distinction. They said, the federal government is not entirely evil, just the military, but HUD and housing or health or whatever, those we can take money from. But we can't invest in treasury bonds because that represents the country as a whole, and the country as a whole, the government as a whole is not pure. So one of the big emphasis, in the Itchberry reactor, because it was a reactor that was called out, and they wanted to get rid of it. But one of the big focuses was on investments and contracts with these entities, the University of California, the federal government, and corporations. And so how did this, what did it actually say? So one of the interesting ones was, as I said, about the city has an investments policy, and this is for surplus funds. This is money, the cash flow is not uniform, and the city comes in more in the winter than the summer because of the way property taxes are assessed. And so the city invests the surplus money in an investment fund, and they were essentially prohibited from buying treasury bonds because they said treasury bonds were associated with nuclear weapons. Okay, but they could invest in bonds from the Farm Credit Bureau, usually student loans, if they wanted to. And essentially, they had a statement that says investments in United States Treasury securities may be made, but there was one loophole. They said it could be made by the city, but only when no other reasonable alternative existed. So effectively, since that time, the university has not bought any treasury bonds in the city to this day. It does, as I say, have it buys bonds from Goldman Sachs and other institutions which we may have issues with, but it doesn't buy treasury bonds. So it does have farm credit and from other agencies that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons. But with the University of California, they took a different approach. They said, the university is tainted as a whole, okay? And so any contract with the university, whether it's with campus in Berkeley or campus on UCLA or Berkeley Lab that doesn't do any weapons work, they have to get a waiver for any kind of contract that the city does with some aspect of the university. And I'll give you 3 examples here. One was recently, as 2015, the city passed a sugar-sweetened beverage tax, and they were generating money, and they came up with a program, and they wanted some experts in public health on campus to help them evaluate whether this was the best way to do it or there were better ideas. They had to go to the Peace and Justice Commission and get a waiver, which adds minimally extra month and sometimes multiple months. There was also, the city wanted to, their energy group wanted to work with some people at Lawrence Berkeley Lab to submit a grant to get money to develop a clean energy microgrid. Nothing to do with nuclear weapons. They had to go in front of the Peace and Justice Committee and get a waiver. And finally, one of the oddest ones is in 2016, they wanted to do a contract for some real estate services with the Public Works Department in Contra Costa County. Why they would, but they refused to certify that they didn't do any nuclear weapons. There's a checkoff list on a contract you have to check off saying, we don't do any nuclear weapons work. And their lawyer probably said, don't sign it. We don't know what it quite means. And so they had to go and ask for a waiver for this $50,000 real estate. One of the more interesting ones was around the public library. Okay? The public library back in 2004 decided to automate, put in a self-checkout system. They bought some software from a small software company to do that using RFID technology. And then 4 years later, this system became more valuable, and a big conglomerate, 3M, bought them. Okay, and suddenly, when their service contract to maintain this system ran out in 2009 or 8, they had to go and 3M now is providing the contract. They sent the contract to 3M, and they wouldn't check off that they didn't do any of the work. They wouldn't certify they didn't do anything for whatever reason. Okay? And so the library asked the Peace and Justice Commission to issue a waiver, and they refused to issue a waiver. They said the fact that 3M wouldn't certify it presumes that they're guilty of something. And so they said, we can't certify it, we can't sign it because the waiver, because it would violate the Reactors. Eventually, after some hearings, the City Council overruled the Peace and Justice Commission and actually granted the waiver. So where are we today, and why do we want to change this? And most of this is going to be discussed by Andrew, but I just want to give you, this is where we were in 1986 when this thing was passed. Okay, you were at the peak of the number of nuclear weapons. There's been a lot of good things happen in a way that the number of nuclear weapons have decreased. The weapons in stockpile by 80%. The bad news is that there are more countries now that possess them. And if you look at there was an article in the New York Times, is that the number of weapons you would need to, using the old MAD, mutually assured destruction criteria, to decimate, which is destroy 25% of the other country's population, you only need 147 weapons, according to this study, to decimate population in Russia. So you don't need a lot of nuclear weapons. If you had China, because they have a huge population, it inflates the number. So their estimate is that there's something like, both stockpiled and retired but not deactivated, 15,000 still warheads. So I want to leave you, before Andrew takes over, is this is kind of where we were, is that there's been a lot of good things that happened. That much of the world, the green here shows the country, the countries that that are basically nuclear weapons free, and mostly in the southern hemisphere. The other good thing is the pink countries that had nuclear weapons and gave them up. Mostly they're parts of the former Soviet Union and South Africa. But much of the northern hemisphere, the black are the countries with nuclear weapons, the red are ones that are in nuclear weapons projection zones. So if they get attacked, their patron may respond with nuclear weapons. And then we have these two existential threats. Still we have 15,000 nuclear weapons. We have climate change, and the question is can we focus this ordinance on reducing the number of nuclear weapons with the idea along earlier, they're supposed to have a peace conversion plan, use those resources to mitigate climate change or stabilize our climate. And I'll turn it over to Andrew to discuss that part.
All right. Thank you, Gordon. So, when Kelsey and I first started this, what kind of motivated us to do this was seeing the signs all around the borders of the city. We wanted to, our original goal was to try and eliminate those signs being from the nuclear engineering department. And we looked into it, talked to Gordon. We weren't sure how we were going to do this. One possibility was to just completely repeal the act. Granted, we did not think that was very realistic in a city like Berkeley, so we just decided instead to update it. And instead of it being just a nuclear-free act, it'll be a nuclear weapons-free act. And the point of this would be shifting the focus primarily from all-encompassing nuclear to specifically to nuclear weapons, which was kind of the original intention of this act in 1986. The way we do that is it would say that the city would call for a ban of nuclear weapons worldwide by 2045. This is the 100-year anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so it just seemed very appropriate. Then we also wanted to take care of those issues Gordon talked about earlier with the contracts and city investments. We wanted to ease those restrictions and make it easier for the city to make these contracts, and also just it would save them time and money and make it just a whole lot more efficient. Then we wanted to also take this original law. A lot of it was based on, it was obviously written by an activist who they didn't have a strong science background. There's a lot of just, I would say, opinions stated in there and not really facts, which I will get to in a minute. So we wanted to kind of base this off of international treaties, sort of more scientific evidence and scientific facts, and then also incorporating federal regulations, because it could be argued a few of the things that this law did overstep the bounds of what the city could and couldn't do. So first is the ban on nuclear weapons. This is not unprecedented for the internet, for the world. In 1925, all the countries in the world agreed to not use both biological and chemical weapons at the Geneva Convention. Then in 1972 and 1973, they also passed laws prohibiting both the possession, trade, and production of both biological and chemical weapons. So this was another sort of weapon of mass destruction that was banned by the world. However, nuclear does not quite have the same ban, but there are treaties in place that try and limit it. The most famous of which is the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, or NPT. This tried to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons by capping the number of legal nuclear weapon states and encouraging those nuclear weapon states to not to limit their weapons and then reduce it. With that in mind, the U.S. and Soviet Union passed the SALT treaties, which that didn't really reduce the stockpile, but it decreased the rate, or it slowed down the rate of increase of their nuclear weapons. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that they started signing the START treaties, which actually did reduce the number of nuclear weapons stockpiled. The most recent of which was back in 2010. And even earlier this year, there was a treaty passed at the UN, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This was signed by 122 out of 193 UN member states, and it called for an outright ban on all nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, none of the nuclear weapon states actually signed this, so it was really more of a symbolic gesture. But we're able to use some of that language in this updated law. Just sort of a proposed plan for phasing out. Right now, this represents all of the nuclear weapons stockpiled all across the world, from Russia to North Korea. Russia and US obviously have the largest amount. They both have around 4,000 each, whereas the next largest one, France, has about 300 warheads. So obviously there's a huge difference. The New START treaty, they put a limit of 1,550 deployed nuclear weapons, and I can't recall if it does actually limit the number of stockpiled, but it does place a limit on the number deployed. We would propose that instead of having 4,000 stockpiled and 1,500 deploy, just reduce that number to 1,500 deploy by 2030. And then at that point, you have to reduce it by another little over 1,000 to get it to both Russia and the US each have 300, and now they are on the same order as all the other countries. And at that point, it would be more reasonable for every country to reduce or to completely eliminate their nuclear weapons, because many of these countries are not going to eliminate their nuclear weapon stockpile if other countries still have nuclear weapons. So this is sort of what our proposal is for going to 2045. The other parts of the bill we are proposing, we wanted to remove some inaccurate information, some of those opinions I talked about earlier. One of the things when it talks about nuclear reactors is it talks about it being part of the nuclear weapons fuel cycle. It implies that really that is what nuclear reactors are used for, is to produce fuel for nuclear weapons. Technically, anyone who's worked a reactor, there are proliferation risks, but in reality, most governments are not really going to use reactors to produce nuclear weapons. There's much more efficient ways, as saw recently with Iran, with the centrifuges, and there's gaseous diffusion. There's many other methods that would be much more efficient in producing nuclear weapons. So there's not really a need to include this in this nuclear weapons ban. Then they also talk about the dangers of radiation. The dangers of radiation, they're just based kind of on hearsay. There's not really much science or any numbers to back any of this up. It just talks about the dangers posed to uranium miners and transporting radioactive material. Doesn't give any context, it just says you are putting them in unnecessary danger by doing this, so we need to oppose any sort of uranium mining or any transportation. As well as just talking about the radiation released from reactors. It literally just says radiation is being released from reactors. No context, it's a dangerous amount, just flatly states that, which, yes, is true, but doesn't really add anything to the conversation. And then also one of the more questionable parts is the way this law is written, it makes it sound like there's a nuclear weapons agent on every corner, or that they expected that to happen. I guess during the Cold War, they were afraid of the US government coming in and producing a lot more nuclear weapons, especially near the UC campus and the National Lab. But this seemed a little bit kind of overly paranoid and unnecessary to put. So we did kind of pull back on that language a little bit.
Was there, I mean, even to this day, if I took a guess, I would say there's probably 25 or 50 live or more employees who live here, including myself, formerly, and the question is whether this is a proscription against thinking at nighttime.
Yes.
So, I don't know. Was that the intent of the law?
It was the intent. The intent was more of building.
With a nation.
Yeah, they were kind of defined as someone who kind of built nuclear weapons within the city limits. So, I mean, I guess you could argue, well, you're thinking about it and designing it in your mind, so that counts sort of as building it, right? So, yes, maybe they'll fine you for thinking about nuclear weapons at night. Another couple statements, these are just straight from the law. There is no safe means known for the disposal of nuclear waste. Keep in mind, this was before the Yucca Mountain proposal. This was in the middle of the Yucca Mountain debate back in the 80s. And then also, this could be very easy to argue. You can't just flatly say there is no safe means. So this sort of language we just completely removed. And then also this one right here. This is obviously written during the Cold War. Children are especially frightened, depressed, and disturbed by having to face the threat of extinction each day. This is in the city charter. So this is something we felt was necessary to sort of remove language like this because it doesn't really add anything to a law. There was also sort of goes into now what the city is trying to tell the university and national labs what they can and can't do. There is an outright ban on, the city law does say the universities and labs cannot start any nuclear weapons research. Right now, obviously, UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab do not do that. However, the city does not have the jurisdiction to tell them that they cannot do this. Obviously, the National Lab is a federal institution. They listen to the federal government, not the city government. There were also those requirements of the nuclear weapons agents. Gordon mentioned earlier about the public right to know. This public's right to know is basically saying each nuclear weapon agent had to give a detailed report of what they were working on so that it could be published by the city council for any member of the public to read. Obviously, if you're working on classified work, that cannot happen. It also required that you identify any location where nuclear weapons work was happening by putting up a public sign. This is a major security issue. As well as they do require fees and penalties of those nuclear weapon agents. So pretty much all of this was removed from the new law. We also wanted to remove some of this language, and we did keep some of the language about the practical applications. As Gordon mentioned, there are exemptions for like medical applications and accelerators. They talk about smoke detectors and other similar devices that use radiation. We did want to keep a lot of that. We also wanted to add an exemption for non-proliferation. The whole point of this law was to be against nuclear weapons. What better way to be against nuclear weapons as in study how to stop the spread of them and stop countries from developing them. We wanted to also encourage climate change. We also wanted to encourage there to be climate change research. We ended up removing any mention of nuclear reactors from this law, but we do encourage that the funds for nuclear weapons, if they would actually ban the nuclear weapons, those funds could be then used to combat climate change. In the original law, they did have like a laundry list of sort of what they wanted to replace the nuclear weapons, like housing the homeless, new roads, a better infrastructure, that sort of thing. And we just sort of add that climate change to that list as well. So next is the actual contracts and investments that Gordon talked about earlier. We changed the language so that basically the restrictions would be anyone who has a substantial part of its economic activity for nuclear weapons. So essentially, you can invest in a company who primarily develops nuclear weapons. However, that would not stop companies at Berkeley from making contracts with 3M. It removes any restrictions on city investments, sort of with U.S. Treasury bonds, by saying they essentially couldn't invest directly in nuclear weapons work. So U.S. Treasury bonds would not meet that requirement, and this still would kind of preserve that purity of Berkeley and not paying for nuclear weapons directly. The nice thing about adding these, loosening up these restrictions, it really helps UC Berkeley and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. It's currently UC policy for no campus to do classified research. This has to do with the fact that you have a lot of international students. They don't want to have restrictions based on if you're a US citizen or an international student. And so they just have a flat out policy of working on no classified work on the campuses or at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is managed by UC Berkeley. Now, when the law was originally written, Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore were both managed by UC Berkeley. However, that is not the case anymore. They do have some corroboration with UC Berkeley, but they are now managed by private LLCs that were set up by the UC system and Bechtel Energy. And so they still perform classified work, but that should not, since UC Berkeley is not directly managing them, they would not fall under the restrictions set forth by this law. And even if they did, this law is set up to say if UC Berkeley, for whatever reason, starts working on classified research and doing work for nuclear weapons, those restrictions would come back into play. But that seems like it's very unlikely to happen anytime in the near future. So those were sort of the major restrictions we wanted to kind of lighten up. We also looked a little bit at food irradiation. In the original law, it required Berkeley to label every piece of food that was treated with radiation had to be labeled specifically saying it was treated with ionized radiation. However, the FDA already requires this, and anyone who shopped in Berkeley, you do not see these labels anywhere. You may see this label, but generally you do not see the Berkeley label. So we just changed it to say comply with FDA labeling. And then the original law, the way it was set up, it was not, they wanted to ban food irradiation plants within the city limits. It makes sense, you wouldn't have this sort of big manufacturing plant in such a dense area like Berkeley. And we also But the way they did it, it didn't actually ban anything. You needed to actually add a section to the zoning ordinance in order to ban this. So we just updated that and we're adding a small section to the zoning ordinance saying no irradiation plants would be built within the city. Then with nuclear reactors, as I mentioned earlier, we are just removing all language that has anything to do with nuclear reactors. This, we don't want it to say, the original purpose was not to say anything negative about nuclear reactors. We didn't want to necessarily say anything positive, we just wanted to remove it completely because the focus of this bill is on nuclear weapons. To many people who might argue, well, what if we remove this language, maybe they'll start building a nuclear reactor here. Well, first of all, you have the zoning ordinance issue again, where this act wouldn't stop a reactor from being built, since it wasn't part of the zoning ordinance. Second of all, there's a moratorium by California on building new reactors, and even then, the NRC would never approve a reactor being built in a city so dense as Berkeley. Plus, there's just physically no land for it. It's pretty compact in here, and it would be very difficult to build one.
Well, I mean, research reactor, and they haven't, Trigas haven't been selling all that well recently, but I mean, they'd be very attractive for a lot of campuses.
Right. Even then, though, the original law would still not, I guess, have restricted that because that was done by UC. Yeah. It goes back to the city can't tell UC what it can and can't do.
It doesn't say you can't.
Yeah, we just removed any language, and this is sort of just an argument against, well, if someone says, why did you remove the reactor language? And then also, even if we did build a reactor on campus, there would be no restrictions, contract restrictions or investment restrictions, because work for reactors is different than work for nuclear weapons. The point of this law was to separate nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors. Or one point of that law, at least. And then finally, updating the signs that are around the city. Yeah. Many of you have seen these signs probably when you enter the city of Berkeley. This is the law that requires us to have these signs. We basically are just want to change what the signs say to nuclear weapons prohibited. This seemed like a much smaller hurdle than trying to just completely eliminate the signs. It still makes people say we're anti-nuclear weapons, but it kind of makes it more updated. It doesn't encompass all of nuclear. It just looks at sort of the more negative parts of nuclear, which is nuclear weapons. So, how do we get this on the nuclear ballot, or this law on the ballot? So, what we're planning on doing is by the end of the month submitting this initiative to the city clerk, who will then pass it on to the city attorney. They will assign a title and summary, which then has to be published in one of two newspapers, either the Daily Californian or the Berkeley Voice. Our plan is Daily Californian. And once it's been published in the Daily Californian, we can start collecting signatures. We have about 5 months to collect signatures. That is so that the city has enough time to validate those signatures, make sure they're all registered voters in the city of Berkeley. And then the city council has to look at it. They either have to adopt it as is or put it on the ballot. More than likely, they're going to be putting it on the ballot. And by then, that will be in November, and hopefully people will be able to vote on it. So
how many signatures do you need to get?
3,500. So that is based on 5% of the people who voted in the mayoral election in 2016, with a little bit of a cushion there. I think the actual number is like 2,900, but an extra 600 to make sure there's a few repeats or non-voters who accidentally signed the petition. And our hope is to try and get some people to help, some volunteers to help get this signed and submit those signatures. Thank you.
As you may know, just a comment. Over the years, there's been a lot of discussion about the role of the University of California in managing the labs. In fact, I think positively, the argument was made that having the university manage the weapons lab versus, this was pre-2006, 2007, an aerospace company or a defense contractor really gave the university, as some representation of the conscience of the academic community and what goes on in Lawrence, Livermore, Lawrence, at Los Alamos National Lab. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, did push ahead and require that all labs with M&O contractors, management and operation contractors, longer than 50 years standing had to be recompeted. Sandia was that way all the way from the beginning, but in 2006, Los Alamos, 2007, Livermore were under this construct where the two major partners were Livermore, or University of California, and Bechtel, with some minor partners, Texas A&M, BWTX, Washington Group, and a few other nuclear operations folks. Interestingly, you may or may not know that the way this thing was written, if your performance assessment each year, academic, security, business processes, safety was okay, they push out the recompetition year by year. Los Alamos went through a very rough patch. And in fact, finally they said this had to be recompeted now. And in fact, so the bidding process opened up. Janet Napolitano went down and told the workforce at Los Alamos that UC was in, but of course it was highly secretive who we would be partnered with, whether we were going to dump Bechtel, which was really responsible for the operations part of Los Alamos, and go with a new dance partner, or whether they're going to stick with Bechtel or not. The sealed bids are due in on December 11th, just a week from now. We will find out who UC is partnered with. We do know that University of Texas and some corporate agency is going to make a bid. Texas A&M probably. There may be others. There is a real possibility for the first time since 1942, the University of California could be out. By summer we'll find out. Could be out of managing Los Alamos. Personally, this would be a disaster. I mean, to split the management of the two labs, which have to work, joined at the hip together as sort of peer reviewers of one another under different M&O contractors, I think would be a mess. Would probably also set the stage ultimately for an exit round for UC getting out of Livermore. I think this would be just a very, very bad idea. But anyway, it all remains to be seen. I don't know if anybody's heard any rumors about who UC is partnered with. You, Rick? No. Okay. Other comment here, I read this thing, thank you, Bob, for giving me the details of the charter. In some areas, it's remarkably unnuanced and disappointing. In other, this is the old 1986 ordinance, it's actually kind of interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about, one of the exemptions was for experimental work on fusion reactors, which seems to say that the city basically says, yeah, maybe fusion is a very good option for clean, abundant energy. In your talking with the folks in the city government, do they actually think more kindly or in a more nuanced way about fusion? Gordon?
Well, somehow people don't seem to understand that fusion is involved in H bombs. The focus is always on the fission, and I don't know why that is in there. There were some oddities like that, and as I said, what we try to do is, in some ways, is take the model of how the city dealt with this federal government with its ordinances and saying, look, we aren't going to have any contracts with the Department of Defense. We deal with all the other ones that are doing things that we apply the same thing to the University of California. So you don't want to have contracts with the Liberal Assembly, that's fine. I don't think we have any way I'd like this. But campuses, there should be no problem there. There should be no even review. These are all open stuff. There are experts that can help the city and Lawrenceburg Field Labs the same way. There's a lot of expertise that we should be partnering with. I can't explain why they did it. And they didn't mention any of the isotope enrichment issue either. I think the people who wrote it, I think Bob did, they copied it from another place and they kept large parts of it, and whoever originally wrote it, that's the way it was. I don't know the detail history. But I think, this ordinance was actually passed by a vote of the people in 1886. To change it can't be done by council unilaterally. It has to have another referendum. Now, the council can decide if you get these 3,500 plus signatures that they agree with it and they can enact it. Okay? But other than that, to change an order like that, it has to go to a vote of the people. So this is the only way really to change it, and that's where we need people to help. I mean, 3,000 signatures is not that big a deal over several months, particularly on campus. You'd have to make sure that the people are really registered. Because they actually go check it with the voter registrar that whoever signed the signature matches up. So being registered somewhere in California doesn't matter. You have to be registered in Berkeley. And then you could go many other places in Berkeley. I think the way Andrew is and Kelsey crafted it, focusing on nuclear weapons, I think it still will be something that will resonate in Berkeley. And we argue that, as I said, that it's a modernization, and we just took out a lot of crap that's not applicable. It may get challenged by this.
So that relates to my question. I actually have two questions. One is, have you spoken to the people who are on the council now about whether or not they would take the 3,500 signatures as representative and pass it, or if they would force it to go to...
That's the law, okay? They have,
right, but what are the other, which
would they
one
like
would
it?
they
No,
do?
we have not. We've just finalized this fairly recently, and until we actually submit it so we can circulate signatures, I think it's probably premature to go talk to the council.
Okay, and then my second question is, have you considered who would be opposed to this, and what sort of grassroots organizing capacity they have, and how you can circumvent that?
Well,
or
I think it would make a
preempt?
big difference if the student community would come out in favor of this. So this is where you play a role. You could get the ASUC or the graduate assembly to say, you know, for whatever reason we feel that it's treated, you know, seen unfair, that this is a good thing. We want the focus to be on nuclear weapons. I think that would help convince people on the council to support. There will be some opposition, I think, from the Peace and Justice Commission. I said we've talked about going and talking to them. We haven't done that yet, but I've made some preliminary inquiries.
If you read the 1986 ordinance, and I brought a copy here, but anybody can download it on the web, it is as plain as this thumb that the authors of this in 1986 believed that nuclear reactors are intrinsically evil. You can't escape that. Nuclear reactors are intrinsically evil. Now they tie it to their assertion that nuclear reactors are intrinsically part of the nuclear weapons business. They not only don't make that distinction, they purposely make the connection. They not only don't make the distinction, they say the opposite.
They deliberately
They deliberately say there is no distinction. Just read it, it's right in the ordinance, you can't miss it, and you called some of that out here.
Yep.
Now, it would seem to me that the people who would oppose this would be people who continue to believe that nuclear reactors are intrinsically evil, and there are people like that. You know, they're certainly out there. I have some neighbors like that. And they would be the ones for whom this would be unacceptable, because that's really what they're after, because nobody thinks there's nuclear weapons going on in Berkeley anyway, and there never was and there never will be, you know. So that it's more a statement of principle than something that's operational. And it seems to me that given that idea, if I was accepted, the most important thing that this thing has to do is to not talk about reactors at all.
Yep.
Talk about nuclear weapons. Now, by the way, it's nutty to ban nuclear weapons in Berkeley because there aren't any and there never going to be.
You could take a different tack, Bob.
Yeah.
The number of Americans who get treated with technetium-99 as a diagnostic per year is about 30 million.
It's a
About
million.
roughly 10% of the American populace.
It's
On
a
the
lot.
average, 10% of the Berkeley populace has benefited from medical isotopes that are produced only in nuclear reactors. I think this has to be impressed on people. In there it says, well, this stuff can be done in some, you know, NIMBY can be done in some other, but I think that's really...
But my notion is that ducking all of that and just not talking about reactors at all is probably,
Well, that was our assessment.
Yeah, that it would be easier to not say anything positive, just say nothing at all, just be agnostic towards
If
reactors.
these things come up during the campaign, you can discuss with Yeah, I mean, as I said, and I would say,
But the text-
why would you focus on nuclear reactors only if, you know, because you have other isotope enrichment? I mean, no one now is going to build a nuclear reactor to produce fissile material by a centrifuge. Like Iran is doing, that's much cheaper, okay, and it's more efficient. It's not, it shouldn't be the focus. The focus should be on reducing the number of nuclear weapons. The aspirational goal is 0, but we'd like to get down to some kind of a reasonable number. Yeah. That's the focus we'd like to communicate.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, maybe the compromise between the mentioning reactors and not mentioning reactors is to discuss them when trying to get people to sign, discuss the benefits like medical isotopes that can only be produced in reactors, but not put the language in the actual bill itself. You can get people that are interested in that aspect of it, but not tie the fate of the bill to that language.
Yeah. I mean, in a few ways, the new law does kind of, sort of intentionally impose the talks about the importance of nuclear reactors without talking about reactors, because it talks about proliferation research, medical isotope production, that sort of stuff. So it does emphasize sort of the importance of that without stating reactors. So it would be easy in the campaign to say, well, how do you get medical isotopes? Nuclear reactors.
It's interesting, I wonder to the degree to what people know that the University of California runs this thing called the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium. It's a $25 million center involving 8 premier research universities and 5 national labs in the non-proliferation mission. Jasmina is the PI. I thought that Berkeley ought to know about that kind of thing. We should make it a point to let them know that we're actually taking a leadership role in non-proliferation.
Do you have the final text of your proposed ordinance?
Yes, have it up here.
Is it locked in concrete or is it not?
No, not yet.
So
It will be by the 29th.
No, I understand, but the suggestions could be useful.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other thing I would say is, I mean, the focus you hear in the news now is about North Korea, and it's the focus on nuclear weapons. And that's why, I mean, this is an opportune time to make this change in a way. The reactors were really a side issue that got put into, say, by trooper leaders, and the real focus, the danger is from the existing weapons. If we can get them less, or we can get rid of all of them, that would be a good thing. We want to use nuclear energy for good things. Generate electricity with safely, that's great. Or we can generate medical isotopes, those are all good things. I don't think that'll be the major issue. I think the major issue that's going to grab people is that, yeah, we want fewer nuclear weapons for somebody in the worst of the fun.
I mean, the main focus is we're updating a law that was developed during the Cold War to reflect modern times. I mean, that's kind of the main emphasis of this, and we just wanted to make it more fact-based and.
But we would encourage people to read it, and we have sent it to a number of people and asked for feedback, or if there are any major errors in it. Or misstatements, okay, because.
This is a thinner document than the old one, or about the
It
same?
is thinner.
I mean, the marked up version is thicker, obviously, because it
Yeah, but you
includes
don't
everything, but
Send
yeah.
them, we can send you electronically.
Why don't you send, give it, I'll circulate it to the department, send it
Yeah.
electronically.
Yeah.
We'll circulate it to the department.
You can do that.
Yeah.
Right.
Chris, just curious, you have to put it, like the text in a newspaper ad?
So the title and summary. So the city attorney says, here's the title of this initiative, and here's a basic summary of what it does. I think we can put the text in a newspaper ad if we want to, but I don't think that's required.
When you circulate it, you have to have the text.
Yeah.
The person circulating petitions has to carry a copy in case someone wants to read it. That's fair enough. But basically, most people are going to look at the summary and the title, which will come from the city attorney.
So one of the things I think Berkeley faculty is so passionate about is the engagement of the university, I think in a very special way in the public forum and what our faculty and our students do there. And so in giving a final round of applause, I also want to call out and thank Kathy Shield for what she has done. As you know, she had a 5-minute segment on National Public Radio with Vetri Vitan, the physics graduate, who created this little app to make graduate students aware of the potential change of the tax law and on how it's going to affect them and how it's going to federal research and so forth. And your piece appeared also, it was at New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times. So thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Gordon, and thank you.